Hello, good evening, everybody, and welcome to Up for Debate. I am your MC for the evening, Jess Beaulieu, and tonight's program is brought to you by Up for Debate, a campaign supported by over 175 women's organizations and their allies from across Canada. The aim of the campaign is to put women's issues at the center of this election. Yeah! 4 parties accepted the invitation: the NDP, the Liberals, the Green Party, and the Bloc. One is missing. Boo. Shame. We have a full lineup of commentators tonight, including academics, heads of organizations, and media pundits. It's been 30 years since federal parties have taken to the stage together to discuss these issues, and in 2015, it is as clear as ever that much work needs to be done to build a Canada that works for women. Originally, Up for Debate had called for a televised all-parties leaders debate focused on women. When it became clear that this would not happen, the campaign went to Plan B, to do one-on-one exclusive interviews with all federal party leaders on women. With the support of the Toronto Star and Le Devoir, tonight's event is being live streamed across Canada. Very exciting. And the full-length interviews will be released in both French and English, one by one throughout the course of this week. And tonight we'll see highlights of those interviews. And as I said, I am the MC for the evening, and I'm so excited to be here. I am a comedian and a writer and a feminist activist. Thank you. I was recently a part of a campaign to remove tax from menstruation products. And I have a podcast about periods called The Crimson Wave. And I'm currently on my period. You too? You just finished. Oh. Who is on their period right now? That's pretty good. It's a lot of women synced up. Maybe that's why Stephen Harper didn't want to participate. Is he scared of menstruating women? Yes. I mean, he did pass that bill, but part of me wonders if he really knows what a period is. Like, maybe he thought it was a bill for grammar? I don't know. That's definitely a possibility. I love my period very much. I'm a big advocate for discussing it. I actually think Stephen Harper would probably be more interested in women if our period blood was made of oil, maybe. Maybe if once a month we bled oil, he would be here tonight. We'd be a lot more useful to him, I think, in that case. If you can't tell, I am not a fan of Stephen Harper. I don't speak for anyone else here tonight. Wink. Just for me, these are my words alone. I have many reasons for that, one of them being that I'm Métis, and yes, thank you. I'm Aboriginal. So I'm problematic for Stephen Harper on many levels. You know, he doesn't like me for many reasons. You know, I'm a woman, I'm Aboriginal, and I read the news. He doesn't like people who know things. He tries to silence everyone all the time. I think that if he had control over the media, all that would be reported on was like, job creation is going well. The budget is definitely balanced. This is how I get my hair to look like that. I would like to know that, actually. I don't think his hair obeys the laws of physics. But he probably wouldn't know because he hates science, right? Also why he doesn't know what a period is. He doesn't understand the female anatomy. It's amazing, though, how much he doesn't want any Canadians to know anything about what he's doing, really. Like, I wouldn't be surprised if Stephen Harper sent a daily email to the Toronto Star that just read, "Shh, don't say that. No." But more about his hair. I don't understand how that works. Is anyone else perplexed by it? Is it real? Is it an animal on his head? Is it like a dead shrub that he wears as a crown to celebrate his terrible environmental policies? Is that what it is? It's a helmet to protect him. Yeah. I'm sure a lot of tampons have been thrown at Stephen Harper at his head. Or maybe it was just the deal that he made with the devil, I don't know, to become prime minister, that they're like, you can run Canada, but your hair is going to look bad for like 12 years. Well, I'm really excited for tonight, everybody. The other parties were involved, so I won't roast them. I'll just keep it to Stephen Harper's hair. But I'm really excited to introduce an amazing woman for our first segment. So to get us started, we wanted to hear straight from the woman who sat down with the leaders on these issues, Francine Pelletier. Please give it up for Francine. So in addition to writing for La Presse, the Montreal Gazette, and Saturday Night Magazine, Francine Pelletier has worked as a correspondent and as co-host of The Fifth Estate for CBC Television. She is founder of the feminist newspaper La Vie en Rose, and, all right, yes, and now shares her time between documentary filmmaking and her column in L'Etoile. So please welcome Francine, everybody, again.
Thank you.
So Francine, what made you want to take on this project?
Well, it was an easy decision. You know, I've been a journalist for a long time, but I've been a feminist for even longer. And I too chafe at the idea that women, after all this time, are still being marginalized. So I think it's rather outrageous that we've waited 30 years to have another debate and didn't actually manage to have the debate. But I think, but it's a sign, though, that something's happening again, I think, in terms of women's issues. I think, I'd like to think so, anyway. And that's why we had up for the campaign now, as opposed to 5 years ago or a couple of years ago.
Yeah.
So we just have to keep the pressure on them.
We definitely do. So why is it important that you feel that women are discussed in election conversations specifically?
Well, you know, women are 54% of the population, 47% of the workforce, and I think growing. I mean, we've made great strides in the last 30 years since the last debate. I mean, women really are no longer invisible. And yet, the questions that directly pertain to us are still invisible. So there's something is amiss there, and it's harder to understand actually now than it was in 1984 at the height of the women's movement. We knew we had to push this button, this button, this button, and we just get there. We've been pushing all those buttons, and somehow there is something that is still stuck there, and that's a kind of mystery, which I think is called latent sexism, but it's invisible. I mean, even people don't even realize it's there. When I say people, I mean mostly men, but yeah.
Well, I think that's why events like this are so important, to point out these issues and make them obvious.
Yes.
Because I think they do get swept under the rug a lot of the time.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, I'm gonna just ask one more question. So tell us about your experience interviewing the leaders. Was it what you expected? Was it different? What were they like?
Well, actually, I had interviews, most of them before, on Radio-Canada and the future of CBC, Radio-Canada, actually just this spring. And Gilles Duceppe, of course, I know from a way back. So it was, in a way, yes, it was as I expected, in the sense that everyone came well prepared. You know, they had lots of things to say. They knew exactly, you know, what we wanted to hear, and you know, it came out in a kind of formulaic way sometimes. I think I didn't get any moments of, you know, there was no gotcha journalism, except I think when I asked Gilles Duceppe why they wrote this party slogan based on a sexist proverb, you know, which personally I think it leaves a little to be desired. He was a little taken aback by that, but otherwise, I think they were waiting for the questions. They were well prepared. I was a little surprised to have them spontaneously say, Maclean and Trudeau, that they were feminists. I must say, I was taken slightly aback by that. Yeah.
Well, that's
so
great.
Maybe that's progress. And Elizabeth May was completely different because she gets it. You know, yeah. She knows what we're talking about, and. It's the whole difference between having a period and not having a period.
That's right.
You know?
I'm glad you brought it back to periods. Well, I think that as a woman, you know, you're the marginalized person in terms of this subject that we're discussing. You're the marginalized person, so you don't have the privilege that men do to ignore these issues. So. And I really like that Elizabeth May in the leaders' debate, she was discussing that, about how nobody was talking about gender inequality during the debate.
No, I think she did a great job of commenting on the last debate where, yeah. You know, she called it three men yelling at each other and the woman on the side, you know, tweeting, "Let me in," sort of thing. So I think that's also a symbol of you know, how much more how much more there is to do, sort of thing.
Yeah.
Before you ask me to vacate my seat,
okay.
I just want to say that I would like to. You're going to see the reels. It was really quite complicated to do because getting, you know, 4 leaders that are in the middle of an electoral campaign is very, very difficult. They're very, very busy. So it wasn't the ideal always situation, and I apologize already for the technical problems, sound problems, image problems. It wasn't easy, so just so you'll know.
Right. Okay, everybody, give it up for Francine Pelletier. Thank you so much, Francine. Okay, so next I want to introduce our moderator for this evening, Laura Payton, everybody. Laura Payton, welcome here to the stage. Hi. Okay, so Laura has broken news in print, radio, and television, including as a senior online writer at CBC. She's been navigating the halls of Parliament Hill since 1999 and is currently a senior writer at Maclean's. She has the job tonight of keeping everybody on track during the panel and on subject, which is tricky. So we'll be taking a look at 2 separate reels of footage tonight. After each reel, we will turn back to the issue panel moderated by Laura to get thoughts on what the leaders have put on the table. We'll top off the evening with a review from our immediate panel to see what they think this all means for the leaders and their parties. And the first reel is comments from all leaders on the issue of violence against women. So let's take a look.
We need a national strategy to confront violence against women. It's got to engage particularly women's organizations and those in sociology fields who are paying attention to this issue. We need to actually name it and shame it and be out there and have a zero tolerance for violence against women. I mentioned earlier, of course, the urgent need for an inquiry into missing and murdered Indigenous women, but it's a societal challenge that requires a very significant response.
C'est plus probable, 4 fois plus probable pour une femme autochtone d'être tuée qu'une autre femme au Canada. À l'international, comme vous le dites, le viol est devenu une arme de guerre, que ce soit au Moyen-Orient, qu'on l'a vu en Libye, ou on le voit en ce moment à d'autres endroits, on l'a vu au Congo. Donc, il y a du travail qui a été fait chez nous par des gens comme Paul Dewar. Stephen Lewis, avec sa fondation, mène un travail acharné là-dessus. Donc, il faut avoir un plan d'action national pour enrayer la violence faite aux femmes. Aucun objectif en deçà de l'élimination serait acceptable en ce qui nous concerne. Il faut une commission royale d'enquête sur les femmes autochtones disparues ou assassinées. 1200 femmes disparues ou assassinées, aucune enquête. Imaginez que si dans la grande région d'Ottawa, avec une population similaire que la population autochtone, il y avait un tel nombre de femmes qui étaient disparues ou assassinées, on n'aurait pas besoin des Nations unies pour nous supplier d'enquêter. Ça serait fait depuis longtemps. Donc, nous, on va faire ça. On a aussi un plan très concret pour les refuges, 40 millions de dollars.
Would you care to put forth a figure for women's shelters?
Well, the issue with the infrastructure program we're putting forward is we're being a partner to municipalities and provinces. I don't think it's up to the federal government to draw lines on a map or to tell a municipality what it needs and where. Municipalities have serious needs to increase women's shelters, and provinces need a partner from the federal government. And with our historic investments that we've announced, we're going to be able to partner and make sure that they happen.
I restarted the Women's Caucus in Parliament, which is all women in the House and in the Senate. And we do meet, and we did confront the issue of the sexual harassment that was occurring in the House of Commons and try to provide our own advice to the parliamentary committee that was looking at coming up with terms of reference for that. And when we went around the room, regardless of what party we were in, it won't surprise anyone to know that we all said, of course we've all confronted sexism. We all knew of either ourselves or close friends who'd experienced violence again. And that means, the refusal to even talk about it, the ability within Parliament. I said, let's have public hearings and bring the media in where we can all say, yeah, we've experienced this and we're not going to take it anymore. We need to name that and make it unacceptable in our society.
Parliament has no rules about sexual harassment. Why is that?
Well, Parliament had rules only with regard to employees and employers, but had no rules about members of Parliament amongst themselves. It was an obvious gap, but everybody was saying, well, they're elected members, they have their own way, it's politics, that doesn't apply. Well, it does apply. And Parliament will have rules going forward. So I gave an example from 25 years ago where we changed the rules. This is a contemporary example where something should have been done a long time ago. But I guess if you would have surveyed parliamentarians a decade ago, maybe they would have all said, that's not a problem here. It is a problem.
And there's still tremendous stigma around sexual violence as if it's somehow the victim's fault. And that's something I've been dealing with for 20 years, for my volunteer years at McGill. And we need to make sure that we are creating a society that is accepting and respectful and understands that violence against women is not just a women's issue, it's everyone's issue, and men have a very important role to play.
How do you explain that 50 years after women, have been fighting for equality, have made great strides in many domains, but still remain that vulnerable to violence? How do you explain that?
Well, tough to explain. I don't think there's a rational explanation to that, unless all stereotypes of the way things should work. All religions are not very open to women, and it implies that it has effects on philosophy and finally on politics also.
I don't know where exactly to point my finger. I think there's probably an awful lot of factors that come together to shape societal behaviors, whether it's certain types of music. There's a lot of misogyny in certain types of music. There's issues around pornography and its prevalence now and its accessibility, which is something I'm really wrapping my head around as a father of kids who are approaching their teen years. and there's also just the shifting parental roles as well. There's a lot of communities in which fathers are less present than they have been or they might be in the past, and there's a more need to have engaged, positive role models.
Je suis un féministe. Alors moi, j'aimerais bien que quand les gens attaquent les féministes, qu'ils pensent aussi qu'il y a beaucoup d'hommes qui se considèrent féministes et qui vont se battre pour les droits des femmes ici au Canada et ailleurs dans le monde.
I am a feminist. I'm proud to be a feminist.
If the federal government doesn't play a role, if we don't create a national program that actually invests in reducing the incidence of violence against women, then we're failing we're failing ourselves and we're failing our daughters.
Hi again, I'm Laura Payton. I'm Laura Payton, is that better? The mic's on? Okay. Our panel is joining me right now. To my left, we have Alejandra Bravo. Alejandra is the Manager of Leadership and Learning at the Maytree Foundation. She's worked in the public and nonprofit sectors in communications and research. That's Alejandra Bravo. And next to Alejandra, we have Catherine Hensel. Catherine is founder and principal lawyer at Hensel Barristers, a diverse practice focused on serving First Nations and their members. She worked on British Columbia's Missing and Murdered Women Inquiry as counsel for the Native Women's Association of Canada and as assistant commission counsel to the Ipperwash Inquiry. Catherine is a Secwepemc woman from British Columbia. Next to Catherine, we have Kate McInturf. Kate is a senior researcher at the Canadian Centre for Policy Alternatives and an ongoing contributor to the Alternative Federal Budget, and she leads CCPA's initiative on gender equality and public policy. It's called Making Women Count. And next to Kate, finally, we have Angela Robertson. Angela is the executive director of the Central Toronto Community Health Centres and an activist in the Black, women's, and LGBTQ communities. She's a current member of the HouseLink Community Homes and Stephen Lewis Foundation Boards of Directors. Thank you for joining me, ladies. I've got a lot of stuff going on in my chair, but if you see me on my phone, it's actually just to time out our panel so that we have lots of time to get in all of the discussion that we have planned. Okay, so we got an interesting look at the leaders' responses on why they think violence against women is still a problem. They talked about identifying the problem, building solutions and policies. What did you think of those answers? And are the leaders clear on what the root causes of violence are? Angela, why don't you start?
I thought that I didn't get a sense about an understanding about women's inequality. So we heard about parenting, we heard about rap music, but I didn't hear a commentary about patriarchy and about women's inequality and how women's inequality produces and create conditions that create violence in our lives. So it would have been good to hear that, because if I heard that, then some of the solutions that would emerge as a response to issues of violence against women would be issues connected to women's place in the economy, women's place in terms of education, women's place in communities. So that was kind of my early reflection on what I heard.
Yeah, anyone else want to jump in?
Yeah, I heard, I think Mulcair spoke the most succinctly on the issue of missing and murdered Indigenous women, and that is, for our communities, is the most acute issue, and I would say for Canadians it should be the most acute issue, because it's not a matter of enduring sexual harassment or sexual violence, it's a matter of survival. There's very few families. You heard Mr. Mulcair speak about you know, an area the size of Ottawa having 1,200 missing or murdered women. That means that virtually no families are not directly or indirectly touched by this, which think of how extraordinary it is for a non-Aboriginal, non-Indigenous woman. So he was the most succinct on it. I've heard Trudeau elsewhere speak on it, not with the same precision and vigor. And similarly the other parties, but Mulcair was, I thought, did a good job on that.
I think it's really important that this is a debate right now, discussion of women's rights, because I think what was missing there is an understanding that, for example, women have the right in this country to safety of the person, but that right is every day violated, and there are responsibilities on the part of the state and on all of us to make sure that women are safe. And I did hear some elements about measurement and about accountability. Certainly the call for an inquiry around missing and murdered Indigenous women is a piece of that. But we're not going to be able to provide that kind of accountability if we continue to underfund the advocacy organizations that really give voice to women's interests and needs in this regard, and really put to the fore what's needed in the coming years.
We sometimes hear talk about reports and studies, and I wonder, like, do you think we need more research into this, Kate? We seem to have identified the problems, and we know a lot of the solutions. I'm sure you women would all have ideas on how to take care of some of these problems. So, you know, are you hearing enough for solutions out of the leaders?
Yeah, I mean, in terms of the research question, yes, we need more research. Right now, you know, we know that only 1 in 10 sexual assaults is ever reported to the police, and about 3 in 10 incidents of domestic violence are reported to the police. So crime rates are not telling us what's happening in women's lives. And the only survey that we have that's conducted by our government is conducted once every 5 years. It asks women directly if they've experienced these forms of violence. So it gives us something of a national picture, but we have exactly 0 data at the municipal or provincial level on levels of violence, whether they're going up, whether they're going down, whether what provinces are doing is working or not working. So if we're going to have good public policy to address this very urgent issue, we need to know if it's working or not. And right now, we don't have that data. And I mean, of course, the more important thing is to get in there and stop this. We have enough data. I want to say this. We know enough. We know enough to know that millions of women are dealing with this. We know enough to step into the ring and do something about it. But yes, we need more data. We also need more action.
Don't forget to hold your mic nice and close when you're making...
On the issue of data as well, you know, we've had our capacity to look at whether the minimum floor of protections for women is working, where we're failing in relation to poverty, access to housing, and other important services because of the deliberate decisions of the federal government to undermine our capacity to collect data through the census. And I think that that's disproportionately going to affect women who are the majority, but also speak for their children. And that's an issue that's a big issue for Canada.
Well, let's talk about some of the more clear commitments that the leaders talked about. For example, the inquiry into missing and murdered Indigenous women, a national action plan to end violence against women. They've also spoken about some funding for shelters. Are these commitments specific enough to make a difference? And are we getting, Catherine, the money? Are they promising the money that they need?
I would like to see more precision and a more firmer commitments, particularly on the, sort of be a one-note wonder on this, but on missing and murdered Indigenous women. You could have the equivalent of a round table and just a bunch of policy wonks and forgive me, leaders sitting around and largely speculating about why so many women are lost. What you need is a rigorous and unfortunately, it's pretty resource-intensive inquiry, investigation, judicially conducted investigation. You know, Western society has a tradition of and it's reflected in commissions of inquiry, of examination, cross-examination, and judicially conducted inquiries. And I think that's what's necessary here, as well as the broader policy debate, to really find out what has happened, why. I think the Canadian public has made it clear that it's important enough to spend the resources. People know that the women are gone. They don't know how to, government and the public do not know how to stop it from happening in the future.
So, and Angela, I'll come to you next. You know, the Conservatives will say, well, we've done all kinds of investigation. This is not something we need to do an inquiry into. How would you respond to that?
They have not. They have increased sentences, mandatory minimums, which is actually counterproductive by all accounts. They've decreased funding for social, they have maintained discriminatory underfunding of social health and education programming for on-reserve First Nations people. All of these things increase the vulnerability of women. And they've done this across society, but don't forget that for Indigenous women, everything that renders women vulnerable is magnified, I'd say, by a factor of 10 and renders them even more vulnerable. It has a disproportionate impact. And they've actually exacerbated it. So Indigenous women living on reserve get less than non-Indigenous women on every indices that would protect them and render them stronger and less vulnerable. And this government has consistently, since its early days, pursued that agenda.
Okay, Angela?
And I just want to echo and continue in terms of the comment about funding, because I think we may get an inquiry, but that needs to come with a commitment to invest in the action and solutions that come out of that. Because other than that, then we will end up with yet another document whereby folks can feel good about having done this without any significant change for the lives of Indigenous women. And I think that we as communities of immigrants in this country need to hold our government, that's going to come, and hopefully with a change, accountable for actually delivering on those actions. Because I think, if not, then I think we become complicit through our silence in not demanding action. And I think as well, one of the other things that we have seen that governments has successively done is that they have said we can't act because there isn't enough evidence against which we can use to take action. And I think there is enough evidence about the presence of violence against women in our lives that governments must take action, and I think it's incumbent upon all of us to hold them accountable for doing that.
What's the one thing that you would need if you could pick? I know there's probably a big list, but if you could pick one thing that would make a big difference in the people that you work with, in the communities where you work, what would that thing be?
You're going to say one, and I'll try to push back and be a feminist in a room of other feminists, and say that I think one is around the economy. So when you look at the gender inequality around women's income, the precarious nature of women's employment, is we know that economic precarity, I think, really makes women vulnerable. And I think when we hear the debates around the economy, we don't hear action about shoring up women's place in that economy. So I'd want to begin there to look at issues of employment insurance. I'd want to look at issues of minimum wage. So within the realm of economy, I think there are significant things that can be done to improve women's condition and to enable women as well to respond to violence when it visits our lives and create real options for leaving, rather than staying because of the economic bind that many women feel in abusive relationships.
Let's touch briefly on the issue of sexual harassment, and we heard Mr. Mulcair talking about it on Parliament Hill last year. You know, the fact that harassment happens even on Parliament Hill, I think was not a surprise to some people who work there. It was a big surprise, I know, from talking to some of my male colleagues, frankly. But it probably doesn't surprise anyone on this stage that it doesn't really matter where you work, there's the possibility of being harassed. But do you think there's something the federal government could do? Is this like a workplace issue that has to be taken care of by the companies where people work? Or is there something the government could do, Kate? And I'll come to you.
Absolutely. And I think, you know, the question about, for someone on the left, I spend a lot of time worrying about money. You know, one of the things that the government needs to keep in mind is that violence against women, by their own estimates, costs our economy over $12 billion with a B, dollars a year. So a per capita cost that's close to the impact of smoking, for example, on our economy. So we can't afford not to do it. And I think that one of the big shifts that I've started to see in terms of public discussions around violence against women and around sexual harassment, and that I would like to see our government follow suit, is around really focusing on the perpetrator and not the victim. Focusing on, instead of asking, well, why didn't she come forward, or why did she go to the police, or, in no other public safety issue do we teach victims how not to be victims. Nobody says, oh, don't wear black, you pedestrians, because you might get hit by a drunk driver.
The Toronto police actually do blame the pedestrians for it.
But look, the point is that we need to talk about perpetrators. Right, and that's what we need to address ourselves to as policymakers, as leaders, as community activists. And why is it happening? And we need to stop before Frosh Week, or start before Frosh Week, right? We can't wait until our boys, I'm the mother of a son, we can't wait to have this conversation until people are in university, much less, MPs on the Hill. Like 50 is too late to be having that conversation. So we need to start a lot earlier and be less scared to talk about it. And think more about the kind of society that we could give to our children if we actually talk to them about respecting each other and having consent and treating women with dignity.
Alejandra, I'll give you the last word for this segment.
Well, I think that the courage of the NDP MPs who came forward, they didn't become public with their names, but to talk about their experiences really shed a light on this for the rest of Canada. The construction of masculinity, this toxic masculinity, something that's really important to take on. Indication from the federal government that there'll be zero tolerance. Creating a culture at the very least at the highest levels of office is really critical. But the federal government does have a lot of people that work for it. There's a power of procurement. And then there's the direction to police and investigations about how those are conducted so that women really feel that when they come forward, they are going to get a hearing and that action will take place.
Well, and that's interesting because it was actually one New Democrat MP who came forward. She came forward on behalf of the other one who had no interest in it going anywhere beyond, close friends and top level people at the NDP. So, if you're seeing somebody who presumably has some amount of power who doesn't even want to come forward, what does that say about how we handle it?
Well, I think it shows just what's at risk for women, but without that massive influx of women MPs in 2011, where we actually had a breakthrough in this country with the number of women MPs elected, we may not have had this come to light. And I think the critical mass of women, the kind of environment that's created when women MPs are talking to each other across the political spectrum, that creates an environment for openness. If that one woman was able to speak for her colleague and was able to come forward, she actually blew this thing open, and now there are going to be rules on Parliament Hill for this kind of thing. It's a small step, but I think it does show that we need to have, we need to reach that gender parity and representation in the House of Commons and in every place where decisions are made, because ultimately, if you're not in a leadership position, you can't shape the rules of society. And again, we're not just a minority group, we're actually more than half of the population.
And again, it's not up to her. I mean, demographics and statistics tell us that if you have 300 odd MPs in a room and 25% of them are women, this is going to be an issue. So again, I think the onus is on Parliament as a body and on our leaders within that body to take action, because we know that it is happening. We do not need an individual to come forward and subject herself to the scrutiny of the public and of social media to find out that it's happening. We already know that it's happening, and so the onus should be on our leaders to do something about it.
And I think what happened is should also be connected, and we should make the connection with what we've seen with the RCMP. And the disclosure around harassment and the treatment, what we see in the justice system around the underreporting, the way in which women who have come forward are treated in the court system to defend themselves against the violation. So I think when this happens, we can treat it. Well, the politicians can want to treat it as an isolated piece that they can tend to by putting some policies in place. And I think as a forum of women who are wanting to hold our governments accountable, is we need to say, this dot is connected to this dot is connected to this dot. So therefore, that's why we need a national violence against women strategy, because these things are all interconnected, and not to allow them to break off a little piece and give us some crumb that somehow it's been addressed in this little area, but it's not addressed nationally for women, particularly women who are also marginalized.
And that strategy has to start with outlining specifically what are the obligations of the state, what are the targets that we're going to set, how are we going to get there, removing systemic barriers, and then we should talk about how to resource it, because if this is really a priority, then let's measure where we're going to be in 5 years and then figure out how to get there. That's the only way that progress happens.
Okay, let's take a look at our next clip, and then we can continue our discussion. The next one isn't thematic, but it pulls out the more interesting comments from the remainder of the interviews. Let's take a look.
Here we were on the verge of a debate on women's issues for the first time since 1984. And the woman party leader who wants to debate these issues is me. And because two men decide they don't want to participate, the debate doesn't happen. I mean, I'm grateful that we're doing these one-on-ones with each of the party leaders, but I think it's a terrible shame.
My party president is a woman. National director is a woman. Our caucus chair is a woman. And if you look at the NDP's front bench in the House of Commons, that's the shadow cabinet of the official opposition. The front bench of that, of the 20 places there, 10 are women. We're actually getting it done because that's a fundamental value.
So why do women's issues get shunted aside? One could also say, why does the environment get shunted aside? What are the issues that appeal to the alpha males? We still live in a patriarchal society. We still live in a society where men don't want to admit they're sexist, but there is pervasive sexism in our society. We need to apply gender analysis to the decisions we make. And that's not something that comes naturally, particularly in a society that's patriarchal. I've never worked in a workplace as male-dominated and testosterone-flooded as the House of Commons.
80% of the people who sit on federal boards and agencies are men. That's something you can change overnight. You can mandate as a federal government that there will be 50% women on the boards of directors of all federal boards, agencies, crown corporations, and so on.
And are you willing to do that?
Oh, we've already made that commitment.
La mesure qui favorise les femmes, c'est que j'ai dit très clairement qu'on va avoir 50% de notre cabinet des ministres qui va être formé de femmes. Ce symbole-là et cette action-là va aller très loin vers l'encouragement de plus de femmes de s'impliquer parce qu'elles vont pouvoir faire une vraie différence. Mais en même temps, je reconnais absolument qu'on a beaucoup plus de travail à faire pour atteindre un pourcentage respectueux et respectable de femmes en politique et je m'engage à continuer de le faire.
Now, one very important substantive change that I think will make the world of difference is getting rid of first past the post as our voting system. And I mentioned that's one of the first things I do as Prime Minister. First past the post is mostly critiqued when people think about it at all, because as a voting system that doesn't make sure that every vote counts. But it's much worse than that, because what it actually does is it enforces a kind of tribalism and nastiness within politics that's not necessary. And when you have first past the post removed and proportional representation brought in every country around the world where that's happened, the proportion of women members of parliament goes up. Voting turnout goes up at least somewhat. So I'm optimistic that when we move to proportional representation, we can create a more respectful public space for discourse that will be the kind of place where women are more likely to see themselves as contributing and as wanting to work in that kind of space. I think we're very close to the tipping point where women will make all the difference in the Canadian Parliament.
Je pense que notre système actuel de votation a besoin d'être révisé. Il y a bien des options sur la table. Moi, ce que je veux, c'est pas tout simplement adresser les symptômes du problème, mais bien les racines du problème. Et si on peut avoir un processus en politique où où les gens sont écoutés, où on ne récompense pas le plus ceux qui attaquent, ceux qui livrent leur message de façon robotique.
Est-ce que vous pensez que c'est une bonne idée d'avoir, dans un de vos slogans de parti, de vous être inspiré d'un dicton sexiste, là, qui prend mari, prend pays?
Ben oui, mais franchement, là.
C'est un dicton parfaitement sexiste.
Oui, mais on ne dira plus rien sans ça, là. On n'est pas pour tomber. Franchement, est-ce qu'on parle des femmes? On dit qui prend parti? Qui prend pays, prend parti. On parle du pays, on parle du parti. Il n'y a aucunement question des femmes dans ça.
In Toronto, it's $2,000 a month for an infant in childcare. $24,000 a year. How's a young family? And young people are coming into the workforce with this massive debt from their studies now. How are they even supposed to think about starting a family if the childcare is going to be $24,000 a year? And don't forget, it's again almost always women who have to make the tough choices in their career. Catherine and I went through that as well. I was able to finish my studies because Catherine was working. I was working when Catherine became a psychologist. But we had trouble finding childcare spaces for our kids, and it was a constant battle then. Now, in Quebec, that's largely taken care of. That's a model we want to bring across Canada. It's good for women, but it's also good for the economy as a whole.
What our plan is to actually show up with real money, much more money than Mr. Mulcair can put forward because he's made a different choice than we have. He has chosen as a priority to balance Mr. Harper's budget. Our priority is actually to invest in the community and in the future that we need for Canadians. And that's why we're saying it. We're going into deficit for 3 years. We're staying in deficit for 3 years so we can come out in 2019. And so right now, we can start investing in childcare spaces and in the other infrastructures that Canadians need.
Je pense que les femmes ne doivent pas s'effacer de l'espace public. Alors, ces trois partis sont d'accord pour que les femmes aient le visage couvert lorsqu'elles sont assermentées, sauf M. Harper, mais pour le vote ou les services rendus ou reçus par en fonction publique, services de l'État, les trois partis sont d'accord que les femmes aient le visage couvert. On demande aux femmes de s'effacer. C'est faire non seulement inégalité, mais de disparaître comme individu.
Je suis prêt à ce que cette femme ait ses propres choix, puisse faire ses propres choix. Ici au Canada, on protège les droits des minorités. Et si une femme fait le libre choix de vouloir porter un voile, on se doit de la protéger dans ses choix personnels, culturels, religieux, quels que ce soit. Nous devons de protéger les droits, surtout des gens vulnérables.
Everyone has noticed that during this campaign, you have been playing it pretty safe. In the name of the women who are listening to you, women's issues have been traditionally on the left. People are saying that the Liberals are now outflanking you on the left. Why should women believe you right now?
We've spoken about women's issues across the country and every step of the way, and we'll continue to do that. We're going to get it done. You mentioned one of the parties that's running against us. The Liberals are using every excuse in the book to try to fight against quality, affordable childcare. That is a women's issue, first and foremost. We're going to get it done. It's not because they failed to get it done that it can't be done.
He talks about something that he can't deliver. And we're falling into politics right now, and I don't want to, but there's a very clear difference between our party that is willing to invest right now in the infrastructure needs of our country, which includes childcare, and Mr. Mulcair, who says his priority is balancing the budget now and then investing in childcare.
Can I say good luck to all women in Canada, that this election brings us the kind of good government that recognizes the issues that Mr. Harper has been ignoring, that we start fixing the things he broke and putting this country on a good path.
All right. There was a lot in there. We covered a lot of topics in that reel. That was only about 8 minutes. There was a lot of talk in there about women's representation and involvement in political life, and we're having this discussion tonight separate from the leaders' debates. And we're using this term, women's issues, to discuss a variety of issues that affect a really broad range of people. Catherine, do you think having more women in politics would bring these issues more into the mainstream so that maybe like childcare is discussed at the economy debate?
Yeah, I think so. There's no way around it, and I think it would change the tenor in the House of Commons and the quality of the leadership that's brought forward. I think there's no question that women, right-thinking women who are driven out of leadership or out of the prospect of leadership because of the conduct of the testosterone-fueled environment, people in the testosterone-fueled environment. And I also think that, I mean, there needs to be more women. There needs to be more Indigenous people. There needs to be more women of color, more men of color. There needs to be diversity amongst the leadership, so you get better informed commentary than what we heard from Mr. Duceppe. Like that's
talking about the niqab discussion.
Yeah, that's one of the things. There's so much to pick from. I don't know where to start. Like, but yes, he's talking about reaching into that women's bodies and ripping off a piece of clothing with the force of the state behind you. You know, as a member of a culture, a community, and a nation, the Secwepemc Nation, we live a different life. We always have. And it's not for any people, for the Canadian mainstream to reach in and tell us what equality means within our culture. And that's what they're doing.
Anyone else want to jump in on this question?
I think
Angela.
The issue of representation is important, but I think we also need to look, in addition to representation, that we also want a politic, because we know we have seen women in leadership who have not brought a feminist politic, and which meant that what we were then given is we were then told to placate us that, well, you know, you have representation, but we really have no systems change to benefit us as women. So while I applaud the leaders who spoke to the 50% plus representation, is I also want to ensure that those women who will be part of that 50% will be representing my interests and will be bringing a feminist and a gender equality lens to the policy debate tables and to decision-making tables so that my interests are represented.
Yeah. We can look at even Mr. Harper's cabinet. The Conservatives would say, well, there are women in our cabinet, there are lots of women, but it's rare to see women in the really high-profile roles like foreign affairs, justice. They usually get health, environment, culture, Canadian heritage. Kate, is it just about the numbers? How would you set up a cabinet if it were up to you?
Well, if I were Prime Minister, this is all going exactly as I've planned. I think, you know, look, if you talking to women voters, you know, the polls find that women are less likely to approve of any of the leaders of any of the 5 political parties than men are. And that tells me that it's not, you know, they're all in favor of women. I'm so glad to hear that. You know, but women don't have to be elected to Parliament to be able to be part of our democracy. And what we're seeing tonight, and what we see reflected even in the polls with this disenchantment with the leadership of all 5 parties on the part of women, is that our leaders are not talking to us, that our democracy is not including us, that it is not addressing itself to the issues that we are concerned with. And so we are pushing back, and that's why we're here today, and that's why women are coming out, and that's why women vote more than men do in the election, so watch out. So I think it's in everyone's interest, and I have to say, just, you know, I mean, Dr. Killjoy, that's my usual job, but it makes my heart glad to see 2 leaders trying to outcompete themselves on their commitment to childcare. I mean, could we just take a moment and say, you know, that's something, right? I mean, that is something.
And actually, I don't think that would have happened if we hadn't had the breakthrough in 2011. And now we're poised to see another breakthrough, because I hear that people want to change. That's what they tell me. And then we have some really good results, like the NDP's at 43% women candidates. The Liberals and the Greens are about 1/3. The Conservatives lagging behind at 20%. But the reality is that when there's a diversity of perspectives at the table, as you were saying, you get better solutions. And the need for childcare is really evident. How they deliver it, they disagreed on. Do you go into deficit or do you raise corporate taxes? That's something that the public will decide. But we wouldn't have got to that place if we hadn't had women at the table. And when we open the door for the best talent to rise, it also opens the door for other excluded people to get into positions of power. And I think we're also we have a record number of Indigenous candidates in this federal election race. This is really, like, I think that the change that we're going to see on October 19 is going to be really far-reaching.
Well,
I hope.
Let's talk about childcare. And Kate, I'm looking at you because this is something you've written about for the CCPA. It's sometimes hard to compare between platforms. Can you break down the options for us and tell us, from what we know right now, what are the different options the Liberals and the NDP are offering?
Sure. Well, I mean, it's hard to make specific comparisons because the platforms are not like federal budgets. They don't go into line item expenses, and so it's hard to say.
The budget doesn't really do that anymore either.
Yeah. But what I would say is this, you know, at least that we have two parties that are recognizing the need for childcare. I mean, household incomes have gone up in the last 20 years, not because male wages have gone up. They haven't. They've gone up because women are increasingly entering the workforce, and they're entering full-time jobs. The majority of growth in women's employment is into full-time employment. And yet the number of hours of unpaid work that women do has not gone down. They're still doing twice as many hours of unpaid work, and that includes childcare. Now, you know, economists like to talk about things, you know, kind of being fungible, or childcare is not fungible. I mean, somebody is taking care of that baby or not, right? And so what we see here is a response to that reality, which everyone is facing, and the fact that women tend to shoulder that burden more than men. Now, in terms of specifics, you know, we know the NDP has promised a national $15 a day childcare program that would be funded through the federal government and the provinces jointly. The Liberal plan is a social infrastructure plan, so it's part of a bigger package, and they haven't been as specific about, you know, exactly how much money they're going to spend or how it's going to be delivered. I think that they envision something that might be a little more variable by province, which some of the provinces will be. I mean, in Quebec, you know, they've got it, so you know, they're going to hang on to it. There's difference in the fine print, but I think the question is, you know, can we have a government that's going to deliver childcare, because we really friggin' need it.
Angela, do you want to add anything?
And I think when we have seen the childcare issue placed on the agenda before, there have been several options or attempts at this, and the cost sharing between the feds and the province is one that has not gone anywhere. So I think to table that again, I think what I would suggest that we demand is a federal government that takes up the child care funding agenda as its leadership, as its primary, not one of its as one of its primary kind of objective. Because when we begin to do the shaving around the cost share with the province, that's where we have seen ineffective implementation. We have seen significant delays. We have not seen anything. So I think, you know, we need to have a federal government that says we're going to do a national violence against women prevention strategy. We're going to lead a national child care agenda, and to make that happen rather than tinker with cost sharing. Yeah.
And make it not, this is not a women's issue. To characterize it as a women's issue is a form of sexism. It's a person's issue. And we did hear that from Mr. Mulcair, I believe, and Mr. Trudeau. So, you know, but it still reverts to who should be fulfilling that role. No one in the mainstream commentary is suggesting that more men should give up their employment and stay home with the children. No one is suggesting that. The Conservatives are suggesting that support be given for stay-at-home, people who choose to stay at home. They have not incentivized men to stay at home. They have incentivized women who make less money, generally, to stay at home. So.
Well, and this, I mean, I was talking to Lori, one of our soon-to-come media panelists, before we got out here, and I mean, do you think it's generational? Because I don't know any couples where it's not a concern for both parents about like what the childcare arrangements will be.
How many single fathers do you know, and how many single mothers?
None.
Well, you know me. I'm a
Okay.
single mother of 3, a 2-year-old, a 5-year-old, and an 18-year-old.
But then is this a factor of maybe having a parliament that is a lot of older white guys who probably...
had wives.
Right.
Had or have wives and had or have children, yes.
Okay.
Definitely.
And
One piece that I just want to not lose is who is being paid to do the childcare work. So, so when we talk about women's place in the economy, and when we talk about precarity around employment, and when we talk about wage, is at the same time that our governments and the next government is talking about the implementation of a childcare agenda, is we also need to ensure that in that package is also fair wage for women, largely women, who provide child-minding work.
I was going to say the same thing, that the quality care is dependent on well-paid workforce. If you're making the same as a parking lot attendant, that is what gets rolled across Canada. That's not going to be equality. It's not going to be fair. And the federal government has a huge power. This lever is enormous to really transform this sector.
okay, let's tackle one more topic before we go. At different points, we heard the leaders start to touch on different experiences of women. Like we talked about the niqab, there was some references to Aboriginal women. But like, let's be frank, and I say this obviously as a white woman, but you've got 3 white men and a white woman up there. So none of them can really speak from experience on some of these issues. Or can they? Can these leaders address the diversity of women's experiences? Do you want to start?
Well, it's very difficult for a man to address a woman's experience personally, but I think that they can make a commitment to lifting the floor for women in terms of their income, their place in the workforce, provision of affordable housing, the things that women need in order to succeed. And that is a function of recruiting enough colleagues, candidates to surround yourself with, listening to the lived experience of women, and making commitments that are transformative, setting targets, measuring your progress, and then facing the consequences when you fail to deliver. I think that, and it doesn't matter whether the leader is a man or a woman, as long as they're making a difference, and I think that they're going to be there to hold them accountable, because what I see tonight and what I see across Canada is the new feminism for this time, which is inclusive, where there are women of color, Indigenous women, women working for low wages at the center of what we want to do.
And as feminists in this room and allies, we have said and consistently said, the state should not tell us how to dress. So there's a piece for me around this issue whereby some folks will want to say, well, maybe they should on this issue. And I'm saying, no, it is not the place of the state, as was said by Catherine, it is not the place of the state to tell women how to dress and then to use that to vilify particular communities of women. So we have seen it when women are assaulted, well, how were you dressed? We're seeing it here, well, how are you dressed? That means that you are, quote unquote, conservative and quote unquote oppressed in your community. And I think these are insidious ways that the state and this particular government gets to plant seeds about the marginalization and the differential marginalization of women in particular communities that is then getting used to justify state actions against particular communities. So I think that we need to resist this notion that the state gets to tell us what to wear.
Okay. That's a great comment to close on.
And honestly, I get so tired of, I mean, I have, with all respect to my media colleagues, been interviewed in various, and I'm often in, the style section. I talk about women being the soft issues, but what are the men talking about in this election? They're talking about hair and women's clothing, right? I mean, I am tired of men in power trying to relieve me of my clothing. I think I am done with that for all kinds of reasons. And I mean, I have the least cause on the stage to be tired of that, but I am done with it. You know, I think we need to talk about listening. Maybe they can't speak with experience, but they could listen with experience to what women are saying to them, and indeed what men are saying to them from all kinds of communities. And that is not easy, and it is not cheap. And people know when you are serious and when you are, you know, on your talking points. And that's what I would like to see more of.
Thank you so much to our panelists, Alejandra Bravo, Catherine Hensel, Kate McInturf, and Angela Robertson. We're going to head to our media panel next.
Wasn't that great? Yes, amazing. Okay, so we've taken a look at how leaders have addressed just a few of the questions which have been put forward by Canadian women. Did they meet your expectations? Are you itching for more? Tweet your thoughts. Hashtag up for debate. Each of the leaders' interviews will be released in full this week on the Toronto Star and Le Devoir website, so make sure to check them out. Now we are going to have a media panel to hear reflections on what impact this conversation will have on the election. Thank you. Yep. So on the media panel, we have Althea Raj. Yes. Who is the Ottawa bureau chief for Huffington Post. We have, we have Lori Monsa-Bratton. Oh, hi. Who is the social justice reporter for the Toronto Star. Amazing. And we have Laura Payton back, who is from Maclean, as I've already said. Over to you.
Okay, so taking a look at what we've seen so far tonight, let's first talk about the leader who we didn't hear from, Stephen Harper. What's in it? I'll come to Althea first, because I think you'll have a lot to say probably. What's in it for the Conservative leader to skip this discussion, and does it matter to people who vote for him?
Well, I'm going to just say, from judging from this crowd, it seems like this wasn't a friendly crowd to him anyways. So I'm guessing he didn't think it was necessarily worth his time. And I can't really blame him for that. But I think that they probably, I don't know if an offer was made to have a Conservative representative, but there are definitely Conservatives in that caucus who would describe themselves as feminists. And there are definitely strong women in that caucus who I think would have some interesting things to say. So I think it's disappointing that the Conservatives did not offer to have a voice, because there's definitely, this is not like, it's not like people on the right side of the political spectrum don't think about women's issues. They just think about them differently, and I think that would have been a worthwhile perspective to have in the discussion.
There is this idea that, and I think it's been borne out, but you know, the Conservatives only need to get a little bit over a third of voters because there's nowhere else for them to go, whereas we've got the Liberals and the NDP sort of fighting out for what sounds like a lot of the votes that are here tonight. So does it hurt Stephen Harper to not be seen to be out front on issues like, well, broadly women's issues?
Well, if we're just talking about pure numbers, so it's true that the Liberal pool of voter actually is a little bit larger than anybody else's pool of available voter. These are people who tell public opinion pollsters that they're open to the idea of possibly voting Liberal. The NDP pool is slightly smaller, and the Conservative pool is a lot smaller. But Stephen Harper still needs to win key ridings, like the GTA, for example. And a lot of the people that he's courting there are suburban mothers who care about things like Syrian refugees and who care about childcare. And so, yes, absolutely, he still needs to show some attention to women's issues.
And Laurie, what do you think? Is there stuff are there things that the Conservatives have done that might appeal to those women in the GTA, in the suburbs around the GTA?
Well, I actually think there are, particularly in some of the suburban ridings where he has had electoral success in the past. there are families that really like the universal child care benefit, that monthly check that comes in the mail. You know, I hear of, you know, parents who put them in their RESPs for their kids, and you know, I think some of them might be a little bit worried about Justin Trudeau, who's going to sort of take that away from them. Some of them might be worried about, you know, being part of that segment that's going to get that extra tax on that sort of lower rich.
The 200,000 and up.
Yes, exactly. I mean, and let's face it. I mean, in Toronto, particularly in the GTA, there's a lot of families that are making that you know are actually struggling with the high cost of housing, who have incomes of 200,000. So, I think he may be. I agree with Althea that he's missing an opportunity to solidify that support, and it's unfortunate he wasn't here.
Now,
can I just jump in for 1 second?
Absolutely.
So the Liberals are getting rid of the universal childcare benefit, but they're replacing it with a more generous direct payment. And so when Angela was talking about, you know, the state should not be telling you how to dress, we didn't have this perspective, but I suspect if there was somebody who was on the right of the political spectrum, they would have made the argument, well, the state shouldn't be telling you how to raise your kids. And it's not, there are some people who will prefer to have a $15 a day daycare plan or some sort of subsidized plan, especially if they're making less money and they can't afford it. But other people would prefer to have direct checks. Maybe they're also a single parent and they can only go to the food bank 3 times a month, and that extra $490 a month or whatever it is, that goes a long way. So I think that the answer isn't always clear, and it's not exactly black and white for everybody.
yeah, and actually the Liberal plan is, you can tell it was designed by economists because it's not that clear, it's not that easy to explain what it is, which, I don't know, Laurie, does that make the NDP plan in a way more appealing politically just because it's like $15 a day,
Yep.
1 million childcare spaces, that's the plan that's done.
Very smart. Like, I got to hand it to them. And he was out a year. Like, it's almost a year to the day that he announced this. And I'm frankly kind of surprised that the Liberals have waited until today to sort of flesh out a little bit more about what they would do about their childcare plan. Like, I actually think that their plan for the UCCB is brilliant. I mean, to take it away, make it income tested, and actually a lot of families, I think, what's the figure that his plan will?
I think it's 9 out of 10.
Yeah, it's pretty. It will go to a lot of families, and a lot of families in the GTA.
9 out of 10 would benefit more under the Liberal plan.
Yes, exactly. Yeah, but it's been difficult to explain that, and I think if he were able to sort of talk about both of them together, it might have made more sense.
Can we just also add that Elizabeth May actually has a very progressive platform, and it didn't really get discussed, but there are things in there that definitely would go a long way for women, like a guaranteed, like a livable income. She talked about free education. Like, no one talked about education, which is also a really key issue.
Student debt forgiveness.
Yeah, so she wants free tuition. But there's also a lot of things that each leader talked about in depth that wasn't discussed or reflected in the reel. Yeah. So I would encourage all of you, I think that the transcripts are going to be on the Toronto Star website, to go actually have a read, because they're pretty in-depth.
Well, let's get to the more broad interviews. Althea, what struck you, even reading the transcripts, and then we'll fill in the people who haven't had a chance to read them yet?
Well, the only real bit of news I thought that struck me was Mr. Mulcair talked, so I also should correct, the federal government cannot just decide to have a national daycare plan. They can't say, we're going to implement a national daycare plan. That actually belongs to the provinces, and so that is why there are cost-sharing agreements with the provinces. Mr. Mulcair can't say, I'm going to impose daycare on Ontario if he wants it. He has to make sure that Kathleen Wynne wants it, otherwise it's not going to happen. So that's why the NDP plan is a cost-share plan, and the NDP plan, what the party has suggested thus far is that you have a minimum of 40% would come from the province, and the federal government would give in 60%. Quebec would just get the money because they already have a plan. But he announced in the interview that he would be open to some provinces wanting to have flexibility in the charge. So it's, let's say Manitoba decides they want to charge people who make, less than $20,000 $10 a day, but people who make, I'm totally making these numbers up right now, $80,000 a year, $50 a day. He suggested that he was open, that it wasn't necessarily going to have to be up to $15 a day daycare, that there might be some flexibility in that. So I thought that was really interesting.
Lori, what about you?
Well, I thought it was the childcare was an interesting. Sorry, I thought the childcare piece was interesting, and Trudeau obviously knew he was making this announcement because he talked about his infrastructure, social infrastructure program, and I think as Angela noted earlier, there have been many plans that hinged on cost sharing, and I mean the Chrétien Red Book back in 1992 talked about this almost the same cost sharing. They didn't put a dollar figure on how much it would cost, but counting on the provinces to come up with 50%, and we got almost nothing from that. And I think that was the brilliance of the last Liberal plan, which was we're just going to give you the money, but we're going to have to sign an agreement. You're going to have to tell us how you've spent it.
The 2005 agreement.
Yeah, the 2005, the $5 billion over 5 years, which was $1 billion each year. And so I thought that was it was smart actually of the Liberals to sort of wrap it into, as Mr. Trudeau said in the tape, we've got the money, we're going to send it, and it's ready to go. And Mr. Mulcair is going to be worried about balancing his budget. So I thought that was actually pretty interesting. But then when you actually then get into the weeds of the announcement, which I'm still trying to figure out how much of that social infrastructure funding would go to daycare, and would they earmark any? And it sounds like each province would get a chance to determine how much of that they'd want to spend on housing and how much they'd want to spend on cultural facilities. So it's still frustratingly vague for me, but I liked the no strings attached, because some governments have deficits, and I think that is that's going to be an excuse not to do this, and I'm just so tired of excuses for not to do it. I think this way voters and women's groups and people here today can go to their provincial governments and say, there is money for this. You spend it the way we want it.
Okay, and I'm going to throw the same question to you that I threw to the panel. We're talking about women's issues, which is it's kind of a dated term considering we're 2015. These are mainstream issues, and yet we're not hearing about them so much at the debates, the other leaders' debates. Can we consider women a voting bloc? It seems like there's just too much diversity within a group.
Well, it's like you can consider First Nations a voting bloc, but it doesn't mean they're all going to vote for the same reasons in the same way, right? One thing that struck me, and I actually don't remember if it was in the clip or not, but Elizabeth May was talking about precisely this point, some of the issues that don't come up in the House of Commons that we don't discuss, mention the environment, because she believes there aren't that many women. And I think that there's some truth to that. When you look at question period, when you looked at the first Maclean's debate, when you looked at the Globe debate, probably the Foreign Affairs debate, we'll all remember that these debates are only happening because Stephen Harper dictated which debates he was going to. Mr. Mulcair only agreed to go to the debates Mr. Harper was going to, and so that's why we're only talking about these issues. But these are not, like healthcare never came up. There are things that I think perhaps, even things that the Conservatives have done well, like the maternal health stuff internationally, there are things that maybe we would spend more time talking about. There was in 2012 a big parliamentary report done on income inequality, and we haven't heard peep squat about that since then. So I think that yes, perhaps more women actually would change the topics that are discussed. Maybe not necessarily the prescriptions, but at least the debate would get, the topics would get more airing.
And Lori, a lot of people working in the newsrooms nowadays are women. It's a pretty equal environment, and even the top-level decision makers. Has that helped coverage of these issues, or why are we still discussing some of them apart from other topics like the broader economy?
Well, I've seen a huge change in my time in the media, and I think women in management and even young men with children in childcare particularly, they see this as an important issue. And I mean, I can remember fighting to get these stories into the A section. And I mean, people, they get it. You don't, you know, you're more talking about, so what elements are we going to include, and you know, who are we going to be profiling, where are the real people that are going to tell the story, whereas before it was, well, you know, how many people really need this, and well, it's pretty expensive, and you know, we don't need any more national public programs, and so even the debate in the newsrooms about covering these issues, I've noticed a real change, and you know, the panel earlier was talking about the more diverse views you have on any topic, the more diverse ideas come out, and the better ideas you get that come out. And so to say, you know, do we still need discussions about women's issues? Well, I think inviting women to come and give their views automatically starts it going, because as we've seen, the other debates tend to be, you know, economy, it tends to be issues around, it feels very male still to me. And I'm so delighted that this is happening tonight, and I gotta commit. I think Mulcair a year ago, by making daycare a major plank in his campaign, has actually changed things. I think we're, you know, two parties now fighting over their daycare plan. Who would ever have imagined?
And it has been mentioned at some of the leaders' debates already.
Yeah.
One of the hot button issues that didn't make it into the reels, but is in some of the interviews. So again, we urge you to go watch them on the Star website. One of them is abortion and access to abortion across Canada, because in PEI, for example, they're only just starting to make it accessible.
No.
Well, it's not available,
yeah,
but now you don't need
talking,
two doctors anymore,
yeah,
right? So is this another one of those issues that, I mean, because we did even see it come up in Parliament in the past session. I'm surprised it hasn't been more of an issue in this election.
It's interesting. I think for a large group of the population, and Prince Edward Island's a very small place, but most people just sort of, I mean, we haven't had an abortion law here for more than 20 years. Most people accept it, and so they just assume it's going to be available. And so I think when Mr. Trudeau said, you know, I'm not going to run any candidates that don't believe in pro-choice, you know, that was, you know, I think some of the other parties tried to make some hay out of it, but it didn't go anywhere, because I think that debate, I think that's over. And I thought it was interesting that with a Liberal government provincially, that both in the reels, in the full-length interviews, both Mr. Trudeau and Mr. Mulcair said that if elected, they would push PEI to get on board, and because it's a violation of the National Health Act.
And Althea, that gets back to your point on daycare, which is that the federal government can't actually order the provinces to do certain things. So is that...
Well, on this they can, because their money's tied to it, so they can say you're not respecting the Canada Health Act. But to answer, I think, the question you posed, I think they haven't come out and said anything on that before, because they were never asked. I mean, who asked them, what are you going to do about abortions in Prince Edward Island? So probably took an interview like this one to put to force that commitment out of them.
Right. It's just I just think that it hasn't been asked because it's not an issue, because it's only people in PEI.
140,000 people.
Yeah, and that's not insignificant. I've got family in Prince Edward Island, and I know it's an issue.
4 seats.
Yeah, right. But that's why it's not been asked, and that, I actually think it's kind of refreshing.
Well, I'm trying to remember if Mr. Trudeau's had media availabilities in PEI in the past 5 weeks.
Both Mr. Harper, I think actually Mr. Mulcair has gone, or is going to as well. They've all been to Prince Edward Island.
Okay.
So but they were not asked this question, I don't think.
Well, now that they've seen the reel, they'll be asking. They'll be asking.
All right. Althea, what's your headline out of this, out of the interviews that you've seen?
Oh, interesting question. Well, probably the news was the Mulcair thing on being flexible with the $15. I asked his office, but I haven't heard anything back, so I don't know if he let that slip or if he meant to say that or whatnot. So that would be the news. Yeah.
Lori, for you?
Sorry, the news out of this?
What's your headline? What's your big takeaway from this?
That's different.
Sorry?
Go ahead.
Well, that, you know, women are here, and, you know, if the leaders don't want to come in person, we're gonna have the debate whether they like it or not. Like, I love this event. I think this is a fabulous comeback.
No, I guess what struck me is the stuff that was missing. I felt like they could have used more time to talk about precarious work and how that changes, and employment insurance, and how, you know, our life is not going to be like our parents' life, and how does that affect the decisions that we make, whether that's having children later, buying a house now, buying a house, because yes, these are not necessarily gender-specific questions, but they all have something to do with us and our gender. So I think it's also interesting not just to see what they say, but what they don't say.
So lots more material to keep the conversation going.
That's a good way to end it.
Thank you so much, ladies, and thank you. Looking forward to seeing more coverage heading into the election.
Thank you. Wasn't that great as well? Well, that brings us to the end of the evening, everybody. Thank you to all the organizations that made this historic moment possible. Thanks to the University of Toronto Faculty of Law, the Canadian Women's Foundation, Gen X and Unifor, and for their kind support of tonight's event. We also want to thank Twitter, the Toronto Star, and Le Devoir for playing a pivotal role in making sure this discussion and debate reaches well beyond the theater tonight. You can see the full leaders' interviews on thestar.com in English and ledevoir.com in French. And the interviews will be released throughout the week. And the making of these interviews and tonight's events have been organized by various women's organizations. And you can make a donation to those organizations tonight to help offset the cost of production, and we would highly appreciate it. Donations can be made in the boxes at the exit of the theater. Thank you so much for attending. Give applause to yourselves. This was great. And I hope you will join us for a reception where there'll be drinks, music, and food. Thank you, everybody, and good night.